welcome back to the PhatPhish Guitar Studio. I'm Dave, and in this lesson I'm going to be talking about things you can do to improve your lead playing. Now, I think the question that gets asked most frequently of any guitar teacher is, what can I do to become a better lead player? How can I improve my soloing? And the answer to that question depends very much upon where you are as a guitar player, how accomplished you are in terms of your knowledge of the fingerboard, your mastery of different techniques, how well you know scales and theory and that sort of thing. But what I want to talk about in this video is something that applies to you regardless of whether you're fairly early on in your journey as a guitarist, or whether you've got a lot of the technique down and you're a bit more accomplished. This is something that applies to basically any level. And really it's about thinking about the notes that you're playing in a solo and a lead line, thinking about and listening to how they correspond to the notes of the chord that you're playing over the top of, and being able to kind of understand what it is that you're hearing. So for this example, we're going to use A minor, A natural minor, so we'll start off just by recording an A minor chord into the looper to use as the backing. Okay, so we've got an A minor chord there with the notes A, C and E in it. Sample that. What I'm going to do now is play that back and then try playing some notes over the top of it and listen to how they actually sound in relation to the chord. So let's start off with the A. Now that sounds reasonably resolved, doesn't it? As you'd expect, A over an A minor chord, it all fits in. Let's try playing the other chord tones. I've got an A in that chord, but I've also got a C and an E. So let's hear how they sound. Let's start off with the E. Or the C. Now they sound different. They sound different because they're different notes, and some notes are higher than others. But what you should be listening to is how they sound in relation to the chord. As you're playing that note, how does it sit against the notes in the chord? Because you get different amounts of tension or resolution or whatever, depending on how that note relates to the chord. In this case, all three of those notes belong to the chord, so they're reasonably resolved, but they each have their own characteristic. You've got the A, you've got the C, and you've got the E. So you should be able to hear the difference there. And what this lesson is really getting at is about when you're playing lead lines over the top of a chord, it's not about the notes that you're playing so much as how they relate to the chord and how that kind of combines into a whole piece of music that the listener's hearing. You know, you could just shred away all day as fast as you possibly can, and you'd give me the general impression that you were playing in A minor, because I'd hear all those notes of the A minor scale coming at me. But it doesn't have a whole lot of character, because I'm not hearing how the notes that you're playing are interacting with the notes that the rhythm guitar player is playing. And it's the notes that you're playing within a lead line, but particularly the notes that you kind of come to rest on and the notes that you sustain while you're playing a solo. I'll show you what I mean with that. Go back to our chord, just play a lead line. Each note in the scale has its own kind of characteristic against the chord, and this is an exercise you can set yourself just whether you can get a looper pedal like I'm using here, or you can get someone else to play a chord progression or whatever, but just start off just playing single notes against the chord and listening to how they sound. Understand the note that you're playing from the scale, whether it's first degree, fifth, or like a third or a flat third in a sort of like a chordal tone, or one of the non-chordal, or the non-triad tones, something like the sixth or the second or whatever, and listen to how that sounds against the chord. And once you've got an understanding of how the particular scalar tones sound against the chord, that's when you can start to incorporate them into more complex like lead lines. So rather than just playing a single note, you can play a run, but then think about what note you want to end up on and how that's going to sound and how the piece is going to finish off. So what I showed you there was a A minor chord with an A minor scale over the top of it. You get a similar sort of effect though with any minor chord with the corresponding minor scale over the top of it. The way that fourth degree sounds over the top of the A minor chord. If I'm playing a D over the top of A minor, there's a certain amount of tension to it. You'd have exactly the same amount of tension if you played a C over the top of a G minor chord, because you're getting the sound of the fourth degree of the scale over the top of the chord. And using a minor there as an example, but you could use that with major chords and whatnot as well. The reason I sort of start on a minor is what I want to show you now, which is thinking about the way that notes of a pentatonic scale and the way that notes of a full-blown scale or mode sound against the chord. So I'll start off with a chord again. I'm going to start off just playing notes from the minor pentatonic. Or get out in the flat fifth degree and get the minor minor scale. Resting on that flat fifth degree, not so good. Not at all. And what about if we add in notes from the full scale? So as you can hear, you get lots of different tensions between different notes and the same underlying chord, just depending on how that note relates to the chord that you're playing over the top of. Some work better than others. Really interesting example is that flat fifth degree in the minor blues scale. It completely fits in with the scale, it's part of the scale, it's theoretically correct, but because there's an interval of a flat fifth between a diminished fifth between that flat 5 degree and the root note of the chord, it just jars. You've got a fifth degree in the chord and the flat fifth that you're playing in the lead line that just don't sit nicely against each other. It sounds very, very unresolved. Probably not a note that you're going to want to come to rest on, but you could probably use it as a passing note quite easily to give you some tension or some uncomfortable feeling to want to drive the lead line on. And then thinking more about adding in notes that don't belong just to the pentatonic, but they belong to the chord. And then thinking about adding in other notes from the scale, like in this case the second and the flat sixth degree, the other degrees of the natural minor. They each have their own tension against, or their own feeling against the underlying chord. But because you're playing more notes, it's got a richer sort of feel than just playing the notes of the pentatonic. I've got a more detailed tutorial somewhere on the channel that I did quite a while ago about comparing the notes of modes and moving just beyond pentatonics and going into modal type soloing. Really what we're thinking about here is the way that those individual notes relate to the underlying chord. How do they sound? What tension do they give? And which notes are you going to want to rest on part way through a piece to give you a little bit of sense of resolution, but the piece isn't completely finished, or something that you're going to come to rest on at the end of a line where it's going to sound very resolved and very settled and sort of happy to end there. And this is something, like I said at the start, you can do regardless of where you are in terms of your technical ability. It's all about being able to use your ears and think about what it is that you're hearing, and then being able to apply that to your lead playing. It's a very underrated skill, being able to take what you're playing as a lead player and work with an underlying chord progression, rather than just using the chord progression as an excuse to just shred over the top of it and play as fast as you possibly can and show off what technique you know. And that's not the point of playing. The point of playing is to work with and to complement the underlying chords. And when you understand and you can think about the way that the notes you're playing and how they sound against the underlying chords, it will make your solos much better. Okay, I hope you found that useful. If you did, please click like, please subscribe, please leave a comment down there. If you've got a question or a suggestion for a future video, then if you go here, you can send your question in. I'll try and get around to answering it in a future video. Probably safer to do that than it is to leave your question in a comment, because if you leave a comment down there, I might see it, I might not. YouTube's not particularly good at letting me know when people have commented on videos, so sometimes questions go unseen. Using that form is a bit more reliable. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in another video next time. Bye for now.